Hunted obsessions. Collision course. Chapter 1. The Seoul morning arrived in layers. First, the gray light that seeped through the gaps between skyscrapers. Then the mechanical hum of the subway beneath the streets. And finally, the crush of bodies moving with singular purpose through the Gangnam district. Adina Adair had learned to read the city's rhythms in the 6 months since she'd arrived, though she suspected she would never truly belong to them. She stood at the corner of Tehran Row, waiting for the crosswalk signal, her breath forming small clouds in the October air. Around her, a sea of dark coats and purposeful strides. She had stopped trying to match their pace weeks ago, that particularly Korean efficiency of movement that seemed choreographed, inherited, impossible to replicate. Instead, she moved through Seoul like a jazz note in a classical symphony. Present, contributing, but fundamentally different. The Hanseong Financial Building rose 43 stories above the street, all glass and steel and cold ambition. Adina had memorized its angles, the way morning light caught the eastern face and turned it gold, how the lobby's marble floors echoed with the click of expensive shoes. She entered through the employee entrance at 7:47 a.m., exactly as she did every weekday, her ID badge already in hand. "Good morning, Adina C," the security guard said, his English careful and kind. Mr. Park was perhaps 60, with a gentle face that reminded her of her grandfather back in Birmingham. "Good morning, Mr. Park." She smiled, and his weathered face creased with pleasure. This small exchange had become ritual, a moment of warmth before descending into the building's basement level, where the mailroom hummed with fluorescent efficiency. The mailroom was a kingdom of cardboard and packing tape, ruled by Mrs. Cho, a formidable woman of 50 who ran her domain with military precision. Adina had learned quickly that Mrs. Cho's bark was worse than her bite, that beneath the stern exterior lived someone who had quietly taken Adina under her wing, teaching her not just the job, but how to survive in a country that wasn't built for her. "You're late," Mrs. Cho said without looking up from her sorting table. Adina glanced at the clock. 7:51 a.m. "I'm 4 minutes early." Early is on time. On time is late. But there was the ghost of a smile at the corner of Mrs. Cho's mouth. The morning unfolded in its usual pattern. Packages arrived in waves, deliveries from couriers, interdepartmental mail, international shipments that needed customs documentation. Adina's job was simple: sort, organize, deliver. She had a route through the building, floor by floor, a circuit that took her through the arteries of Hanseong Financial like blood through a body. She was good at being invisible. It was a skill she'd honed over years of being the only black girl in predominantly white spaces back home, and it served her well here. She moved through the building's corridors with quiet efficiency, her presence acknowledged with polite nods, but rarely conversation. The language barrier helped with that. Her Korean was functional but limited, enough to be polite, not enough to be social. But invisibility was different from being unseen. Adina felt eyes on her constantly, the weight of curiosity, sometimes admiration, occasionally something less comfortable. Her mother had warned her before she left Alabama. "Baby, you're going to stand out everywhere you go. Might as well stand tall." So she did. She kept her back straight, her head high, her natural hair picked out in a halo of tight coils that she refused to straighten or hide. If she was going to be noticed, she would be noticed as herself. By 10:30 a.m., her cart was loaded with packages for the executive floors, the upper reaches of the building where the air felt different, where the carpet was thicker and the silence more expensive. Adina had only been to these floors a handful of times. Usually, executive deliveries were handled by senior mailroom staff, but Mrs. Cho had called in sick, and the responsibility had fallen to Adina. "38th floor," Mrs. Cho had instructed, her voice tight with a cold she was fighting. "Executive suite. Leave the packages with the secretary. Don't linger." Don't linger. As if Adina would. As if she belonged in those spaces long enough to do anything but deliver and disappear. The elevator to the executive floors required a special keycard. Adina used Mrs. Cho's, feeling like an imposter as the elevator climbed, the numbers ticking upward with mechanical indifference. 38 floors. She watched Seoul shrink beneath her through the glass elevator shaft, the city spreading out in all directions, vast and indifferent and beautiful. The 38th floor was exactly as she'd imagined, hushed, elegant, intimidating. The reception area was all dark wood and leather, abstract art on the walls that was beyond expensive. A young woman sat at the reception desk, her makeup perfect, her suit impeccable. Adina approached with her cart, suddenly aware of her uniform, the simple navy polo and slacks that marked her as service staff, as someone who didn't belong in spaces like this. "Delivery," she said in Korean, her accent thick but comprehensible. The receptionist barely glanced at her. "Leave them there." She gestured to a corner with the dismissiveness of someone who had learned that courtesy was optional when addressing those beneath her station. Adina began unloading the packages, stacking them carefully. There were 7 in total, various sizes, all marked with the same suite number. She worked quickly, efficiently, eager to finish and return to the basement, where she understood her place in the ecosystem. She was reaching for the last package, a large, awkward box that had shifted during the elevator ride, when she heard the elevator chime behind her. The change in atmosphere was immediate and palpable. The receptionist straightened in her chair, her expression transforming from bored indifference to alert attention. Adina felt it too, a shift in the air pressure, a sudden tension that made the hair on her arms stand up. She turned, the large package in her arms, just as he stepped out of the elevator. Later, she would struggle to articulate what she'd felt in that first moment. It wasn't attraction, not exactly, though he was beautiful in a way that seemed almost cruel. Sharp cheekbones, full lips, black hair styled with casual perfection. It was something more primal than attraction. Recognition, perhaps, or warning, the way a deer might feel when it catches the scent of a wolf. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, his body moving with the fluid confidence of someone who had never questioned his right to occupy space. He wore a black suit that had been tailored to perfection, the jacket open to reveal a black shirt, no tie. Even from across the room, Adina could see the edge of a tattoo creeping up his neck, dark ink against golden skin. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. His were dark, almost black, and completely unreadable. Then Adina's foot caught on the wheel of her cart. It happened in slow motion and all at once. She stumbled forward, the package flying from her arms, her body following in an ungraceful lurch. She managed to catch herself on the cart, but the package, the large, awkward, undoubtedly important package, tumbled through the air and landed directly on his foot with a solid thud. The silence that followed was absolute. Adina's heart stopped. Actually stopped. She was going to die here, on the 38th floor of Hanseong Financial, having just assaulted an executive with a package. "I'm so sorry," she gasped, the words tumbling out in English before she could stop them. She dropped to her knees, reaching for the package, her hands shaking. "I'm so sorry, I didn't—" She switched to Korean, the words clumsy on her tongue. "죄송합니다, 죄송합니다." She looked up at him, still on her knees, and the apology died in her throat. He was looking down at her with an expression of such cold indifference that it felt like a physical force. Not anger. Anger would have been better, more human. This was something else. Dismissal. As if she were an insect that had briefly inconvenienced him. "Get up," he said in Korean, his voice low and smooth and utterly devoid of emotion. Adina scrambled to her feet, clutching the package to her chest like a shield. Up close, she could see more details. The perfect line of his goatee. The way his shirt collar revealed more of that tattoo. What looked like scales or feathers. Something alive and dangerous rendered in ink. "I'm sorry," she said again, in Korean this time, her voice steadier. "I wasn't watching where I was going." He said nothing. His eyes moved over her face with clinical detachment, as if cataloging her features for some future purpose. Adina felt exposed under that gaze, seen in a way that made her want to disappear. Then he stepped around her, moving toward the inner offices, and the moment broke. "Kang Kyungmin Nim," the receptionist said, her voice high and nervous. "Your 11 o'clock is waiting in the conference room." He didn't acknowledge her. He simply walked past, his footsteps silent on the expensive carpet, and disappeared through a set of double doors. Adina stood frozen, the package still clutched to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You should go," the receptionist said, and there was something almost like sympathy in her voice. "Quickly." Adina didn't need to be told twice. She set the package down with the others, grabbed her cart, and fled to the elevator. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely press the button for the basement. As the elevator descended, she caught her reflection in the polished steel doors. Her eyes were wide, her breathing shallow. She looked terrified. But beneath the terror, something else stirred. Something she didn't want to name, didn't want to acknowledge. A heat that had nothing to do with embarrassment, of awareness that felt dangerous. She had felt his eyes on her, not just looking, seeing. And in that brief moment before he dismissed her, she had seen something flicker in those dark eyes. Something quickly shuttered, carefully hidden, but there nonetheless. The elevator reached the basement. Adina pushed her cart out into the familiar fluorescent light of the mailroom, back to her world, back to where she belonged. But her hands were still shaking. And somewhere, 43 floors above, in an office she would never see, Kang Kyung-min stood at his window overlooking Seoul, his hand absently rubbing his foot where the package had landed, his mind occupied by golden brown skin and defiant curls, and eyes that had looked at him with fear and something else. Something that matched the unwelcome heat that had flickered through him when she'd knelt at his feet. He turned from the window, his expression hardening back into its customary coldness. It didn't matter. She didn't matter. He had more important things to think about than a clumsy mailroom girl who didn't belong in his world. But even as he thought it, he knew he was lying. The second time Adina saw Kang Kyung-min, she was in the parking garage. It was late, past 8 in the evening. She'd stayed to help reorganize the storage room, a task that didn't need doing, but filled the empty hours before she returned to her small apartment in Itaewon. The other mailroom workers had families to go home to, lives that extended beyond the fluorescent lights and sorting tables. Adina had Korean dramas on her laptop and instant ramyeon in her cupboard. She was walking toward the bus stop exit when she heard it, the low rumble of an expensive engine echoing off concrete walls. The black Mercedes emerged from the shadows like something predatory. Adina stepped closer to the wall, making herself small, invisible. The car slowed as it approached, and through the tinted windows, she caught a glimpse of a profile that made her stomach drop. The car stopped. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. Adina stood frozen, her bag clutched against her chest, her breath shallow. She could feel her pulse in her throat, that same dangerous awareness flooding through her. Then the car moved forward, gliding past her toward the exit, but not before she saw him turn his head. Not before their eyes met through the glass. Adina stood in the empty garage for a full minute after the taillights disappeared, her heart hammering against her ribs. He had seen her. Again. The third time was in the lobby. Adina was delivering packages to the reception desk when the elevator doors opened, and a hush fell over the space like a physical thing. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. The receptionist's smile became fixed, professional, afraid. Kang Kyung-min stepped out flanked by two men in dark suits. He moved through the lobby like he owned it, which, Adina supposed, he probably did. His black hair was perfectly styled. His charcoal suit fitted to his muscular frame in a way that let you know that it was expertly tailored. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the packages she was sorting. Professional, invisible. But she felt him approach like a change in air pressure. "Mr. Kang," the receptionist said, her voice higher than usual. "Your car is waiting." He didn't respond. Adina could see his shoes in her peripheral vision. Expensive Italian leather, polished to a mirror shine. They stopped 3 feet from where she stood. She forced herself to look up. He was staring at her. Not looking, staring. His dark eyes moved over her face with an intensity that made her skin feel too tight. There was no expression on his beautiful, cold features. Nothing to indicate what he was thinking. Adina bowed slightly, the way she'd learned to do. Polite, respectful. "Good afternoon, sir." For a moment, she thought he might speak. His lips parted slightly, and something flickered in those black eyes. Something that made her stomach clench with a feeling she refused to name. Then he turned and walked away, his men following like shadows. Adina released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "Are you okay?" the receptionist whispered once he was gone. "You're shaking." Adina looked down at her hands. She was. "I'm fine," she said, and gathered her empty cart, retreating to the safety of the basement. But that night, alone in her apartment with the sounds of Seoul filtering through her window, Adina lay in her narrow bed and thought about dark eyes and expensive suits and the way her body had responded to his proximity. She thought about strong hands and what they might feel like on her skin. She thought about being seen, truly seen, by someone who looked at her like she was something worth noticing. She touched herself in the darkness, ashamed and aching, and came with his face behind her closed eyelids. Afterward, she cried. Because she was lonely. Because she was 25 and a virgin and so far from home. Because she wanted something she couldn't name and didn't know how to ask for. Because she was invisible, and for one moment in a lobby she hadn't been. Kang Kyung-min watched the security footage for the third time. His office was dark except for the glow of the monitor. On the screen, the mailroom girl, Adina, he'd learned her name was Adina, moved through the lobby with her cart. She was graceful, despite the awkward load, her movements efficient and sure. He watched himself approach, watched her bow, watched the way her throat moved when she swallowed, the way her fingers tightened on the cart handle. She had been afraid, but not just afraid. He closed the video and leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight. This was a problem. Kang Kyung-min had built his empire on control. Control of his emotions, his reactions, his desires. He had killed his first man at 19 and hadn't lost sleep over it. He had ordered executions, orchestrated betrayals, destroyed lives without hesitation. He was feared because he was cold, because nothing touched him, because he felt nothing. But he felt something when he looked at her. It was inconvenient, dangerous, unacceptable. She was nobody, a foreign student working in his mailroom, so far beneath his notice that acknowledging her existence was absurd. She didn't belong in his world. She was soft where he was hard, warm where he was cold, innocent where he was stained with blood that would never wash clean. He should forget her, should make sure their paths never crossed again. Instead, He pulled up the employee database and read her file. Adina Adair, 25, exchange student from University of Alabama. Work visa valid for 18 months. Emergency contact. A phone number in Birmingham with a 205 area code. There was a photo attached to her file, a standard ID badge picture. But even in that unflattering format, her beauty was undeniable. Golden brown skin, dark eyes that held warmth even in a corporate photograph, that halo of curls framing her face. She looked kind. She looked like everything he wasn't. Kyungmin closed the file and stood, moving to the window that overlooked the city. Seoul sprawled below him, glittering and dark, a kingdom he ruled from the shadows. He had everything: power, wealth, fear, respect. But when was the last time someone had looked at him without terror in their eyes? When was the last time someone had seen him as anything other than a monster? The mailroom girl, Adina, had been afraid. But she had also bowed to him with dignity, had met his eyes with something that wasn't quite fear, had treated him like a person, not a predator. It meant nothing. It changed nothing. But he knew, with a certainty that felt like inevitability, that he would see her again, that he would keep seeing her until this unwelcome fascination burned itself out, or until it consumed them both. The fourth time was in the elevator. Adina stepped in on the third floor, her arms full of interdepartmental mail. She was humming softly, something her mother used to sing, a gospel tune that reminded her of Sunday mornings and red clay and home. The humming died in her throat when she saw who was already inside. Kang Kyungmin stood in the back corner, his phone in his hand, his expression unreadable. He didn't look up when she entered, didn't acknowledge her presence at all. Adina's finger hovered over the button for the basement. The doors began to close. "Hold it!" She stuck her hand out reflexively, and the doors bounced open. Two junior executives rushed in, laughing about something, their ties loosened after a long day. Their laughter cut off the moment they saw Kang Kyungmin. The elevator descended in suffocating silence. Adina kept her eyes on the floor numbers, watching them tick down. She could feel him behind her, could sense his presence like heat against her back. The executives got off on the second floor, practically fleeing. The doors closed. Adina and Kang Kyungmin were alone. Her heart was a drum in her chest. The elevator seemed smaller suddenly, the air thicker. She could smell his cologne, something expensive and dark, cedar and smoke. She didn't turn around, didn't move, just stood there with her arms full of mail and her pulse racing, and that dangerous awareness flooding through her like electricity. The elevator reached the basement. The doors opened. Adina stepped forward. "You sing?" His voice stopped her in the doorway. It was the first time she'd heard him speak directly to her, low and smooth, with barely a trace of an accent. The sound of it moved through her like a physical touch. She turned, just slightly. He was looking at her now, his dark eyes fixed on her face with that same unsettling intensity. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "when I think no one's listening." Something flickered across his expression, too quick to read, too complex to name. "I was listening," he said. The doors began to close. Adina stepped out, and they slid shut between them, severing the moment. She stood in the empty hallway, her mail scattered at her feet where she'd dropped it, her whole body trembling. He had spoken to her, had listened to her, had looked at her like what? Adina didn't know, couldn't let herself think about it. But that night, alone in her bed, she imagined his voice saying her name, imagined those strong, tattooed hands touching her, imagined what it would feel like to be wanted by someone like him, someone powerful and dangerous and completely wrong for her. She came apart in the darkness, biting her pillow to muffle the sounds, and hated herself for wanting something she could never have, for wanting someone who would destroy her. 43 floors above the city, Kang Kyungmin stood at his window and thought about gospel songs and golden skin and the way she had looked at him in that elevator, afraid and aware and achingly, impossibly innocent. He had killed 3 men that afternoon, had ordered a 4th's execution, had signed documents that would ruin families and destroy lives. But all he could think about was the sound of her humming. All he could feel was the unfamiliar ache in his chest that felt dangerously close to longing. This was more than a problem. This was the beginning of something inevitable. Something that would change everything.